Hi guys, this is Greg Jones, or 0779 for dragthebar.com, and today I'm going to be bringing you the first video in a new series that I'm making called Tools of the Trade, and this video is entitled Advanced HUD. In this video we're going to be talking about creating a more advanced HUD for profiling players in sit and goes. Alright, so one of the things that I believe about sit and goes is true is that in most cases a simpler HUD for sit and goes is better. You see a lot of cash game players have very advanced HUDs with lots of stats, but in a sit and go, because you're playing a lot of times against a player who you may never see again, and because stats take a long time to converge, you typically won't have enough hands on a player to make a good read with some of these more advanced stats that take a long time to converge. So in ABC SNG, we talk about how using just two basic stats, VPIP and preflop raise, we can profile players and at least bin them into categories of whether they're good or bad players. And then also added to our stats, we have the number of hands stat, which tells us whether we can sort of rely on our reads or how much we can rely on our reads of VPIP and PFR. And then we've got a number of blind stat, which basically just tells us our effective stack size so that we can make good PBJ decisions. Now, if we can figure out from these stats whether our opponents are good or bad, then in the ABC SNG series we talk about how we can extrapolate the play of good and bad players, and typically when we're playing good players, they're playing a lot like us, and then with bad players we sort of profile them as to having certain types of reactions that we then have modeled against and created situations that tell us the most optimum way to exploit bad players. So simply using VPIP and PFR can basically help us to bin players into two categories, good or bad, and then if they're bad, we assume they play like bad players, and if they're good, we assume they play like we do. So VPIP and PFR can tell us pretty much everything we need to know for a sit and go. So why do we want to use a more advanced HUD then? Well, one reason is because against good regulars, it's actually going to give us a bigger advantage over those regulars. These are the guys we're going to play a lot of hands against, and so the stats are going to actually converge, and we're going to actually be able to make legitimate reads using these more advanced stats. And good players, even at the low stakes and mid stakes, are going to still have a lot of leaks that we can exploit. We really just need to find out what they are, and these stats are going to basically be able to give us a bigger edge on those opponents. So the stats that we're going to look at today are preflop raising by position, flop c-bet and folds to flop c-bet, and steal percent from the button. So these stats basically add a lot of value because they come up again a lot of times in different situations in a sit and go where it's actually going to be useful to have some extra reads on our opponents. So the methodology that I like to use when I'm telling students to add stats to their HUD is going to be that I want you to add them one at a time. In the case of the flop c-bet, folds to flop c-bet, we may add them at the same time, but mostly you want to add one stat at a time, and the reason is because you want to avoid information overload. A lot of times people say, okay, well, what's a good stat to put on the HUD? And then they go, okay, well, I'm making my HUD, so actually, why don't I just get some other good player's HUD and I'll use that? And suddenly they've got about 20 or 30 stats on their HUD, and they don't know what any of them are. There's no abbreviations there, so they basically don't know what means what, and they basically don't end up ever using any of the HUD. So what I like to do is focus on one HUD stat at a time and kind of build slowly. We're going to talk about a bunch today, but I still suggest that you will add them one at a time to your HUD as you're playing sit and goes. And then for the new stats, I suggest that you add an abbreviation label, then remove them when you're comfortable with where the stats are on your HUD so that you don't have a really cluttered looking HUD. Or if you keep a fairly sparse HUD like I do, you can leave some of those labels up just because it's still not going to make your HUD too massive. And then a lot of times what we're using is we're actually putting up one representative stat, but we're going to use the pop-ups in game to find the other stats we need. So for example, we're going to look at the button steal stat today, but once you put the button steal stat on your HUD, you can hover over it and click, and what you're going to find is that you can get the stats that you need for stealing from the cutoff, the button, and the small blind, which are all extremely useful to have in your repertoire. And then I suggest that if you put a stat up on your HUD and it's not working out for you, remove it, because if it's not adding any value, it's taking up space on your screen, it's taking up space, you could maybe have another HUD stat. I'd just get rid of it. So here's how you're going to go ahead and add the stats to your HUD using Hold'em Manager. Alright, so if you go into HUD options in your Hold'em Manager, you're going to go ahead and you're going to click on this tab, and then we're going to go to the Player Preferences tab. And this window will pop up, which has three tabs in it. You go to your HUD that you're basically using for playing sit and goes right now. It should have these four basic stats in it: VPIP, preflop raise, number of hands, and number of big blinds. And then what I suggest is when you're adding new stats to your HUD, you want to do two things. One is you don't want to have these stats displayed so that you have abbreviations in front of all of them. So notice that what I've done on the ones that I'm very comfortable with on my HUD, I've actually deleted the abbreviation category. That way they're just going to come up blank. And if we apply that right now and say OK, and we just look at this one hand, you'll see that I've got VPIP, preflop raise, number of hands, and then number of big blinds. So let's go ahead and add some stats to this. And the first one we're going to add is raise first for middle position. So I'm going to go down here, I'm going to say add new line. And once we've got a new line, then we can put our new HUD stats below that, and that's going to tell us, sort of what we're working on, what we need to look at. So let's go ahead to the raise first category, open that up, and we're going to say MP raise first. And then the way you add these to the HUD is you're going to go ahead and you're just going to say, you're going to click this add arrows button, and then I'll just put it right in there. And then notice that I don't really like this abbreviation too much, so we're just going to go ahead and call this RMP, raise first middle position. Now let's go ahead and add the other ones. We're going to use button steal. So we're going to go into the steal tab, and we're going to go to button. We're going to add that. And then I call this steal button. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to go to the C bets, continuation bets area, and we're going to have flop C bets. We're going to add that, and then we're going to have fold to flop C bet. And these two are great because this is going to tell us how often one of our villains is continuation betting into us, and then also we're going to find out how often they fold to a continuation bet. And because a lot of times in a sit and go, most of the decisions we're going to make are on the flop, or we're going to be committed after we make a decision on the flop. We need to have these stats in there. So I'm going to call this C-bet. And then actually what we're going to do for the fold to flop C-bet is we're just going to completely remove this, because what that's going to do is that's going to add a nice little area that says C-bet, and that's going to have both stats. So when you apply this and take a look at the hands, what you're going to see is it looks really nice. You can have the C-bet and then fold to flop C-bet right next to each other. So see here, now we've got raise middle position, steal button, and then C-bet, and then fold to flop C-bet right afterwards, which is it's going to tell us basically every time we put in a stat like this where we have the stat and then the fold to stat, I just put them right next to each other, and I don't use the abbreviation for them. Alright, so that's done. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some of these stats and then figure out what they mean, and then we'll go ahead and look at some hands that we can use these stats to make some reads that are better in the hand about how to play. Alright, so raising first pre-flop is kind of an interesting stat, and the middle position is kind of nice because it basically tells us, it gives us a balance. If we see that somebody's got a pre-flop raise of a certain value, and then we see the middle position value, that kind of gives us a baseline for the fact that they're probably raising wider and later position and earlier, tighter and earlier position than that stat. So this stat's basically going to tell us when it's unopened, and preflop raise sometimes also includes 3-betting and things. So this is a nice pure stat to have. And then when you hover over that stat, you can find all the positions raising first open when you look at the pop-up. Now, just to remind you how to get this stat, I basically underlined the raise first, which is the tab that you'll use to get the stat, and then you'll use MP raise first to put this into the HUD, just like we just did. And preflop raise is useful by position because in low blinds it tells us how wide we can 3-bet, and then in high blind situations it's really interesting because it tells us how wide we can re-steal. So let's take a look at a hand example where we're going to look at a re-stealing situation where we can get a lot wider than the magic range, knowing somebody's raise first middle position. Alright, so we've got Jack 8 suited on the button, and the action on this is going to go that this guy from middle late position goes ahead and opens to 240. It's actually from the hijack, but this is still middle position when Hold'em Manager's looking at it. You can see raise first middle position 20%. Notice that his VPIP is only 14. I'm sorry, his preflop raise is only 14% here. So when you click on this stat and bring it up, you can see it's got a lot of different interesting things in it. Preflop raise, and then raise first middle position. So out of 40 opportunities, we've seen him raise 20% of those. And so this stat is starting to converge. We're starting to get a fairly accurate idea that this is a decent stat to use against this guy. So let's say we can say that he's opening 20%, and we want to know what we can re-steal with. So I don't think Jack 8 suited is going to be a good enough hand to re-steal with in this situation. But let's go ahead and take a look at this in Sit and Go Wizard, and let's see how we can adjust these stats knowing based on his read that we have for him from the extra stats in the HUD. Alright, so this says he's opening 8.3% of the time. And the interesting thing about this is he's a very tight guy. He's kind of got a real tag look to his stats. He's got 18-14, so he's got a very, very decent stats. And when you go in here, what are the assumptions we can make? Well, now we know he's raising first about 20%. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to stick that 20% right in here. And then what do we think that a good decent tag will call with? Because this is the magic range right now. The saying re-raise the magic range. But once he raises and we 3-bet all in, typically the types of hands that you and I would call as a good player are going to actually be something more like, jacks and ace king, because when we assume that somebody's 3-betting us with the magic range, ace queen and pocket eights, then we're typically going to want to call with a range that's stronger, like ace king and maybe pocket jacks, that 3-bet all in. So we can actually put this guy on a range of roughly ace king and pocket jacks, maybe ace king and pocket tens, depending on how aggressive he is. But I'd say that this is decent. And so surprisingly now, because his open in middle position is so wide, and we would think that he's calling us fairly tightly, you can see that actually re-raising this guy with Jack 8 suited is kind of crazy, but it's actually a good play. So this is a surprising result that we can get by using some stats that we know a little bit more about this guy. And basically we can re-raise so wide just because he's folding so many of the hands that he's probably going to open raise from middle position. If you think he's calling a little bit wider, then you can see it goes back to the magic range. And then another thing that's interesting about this is if you were just using the pre-flop raise stat on this guy that we have, which is like 14%. So let's set this to 14. Instead of using the raise middle position stat, if we just use PFR and said, well, he's probably raising about 14%, you can see that the result would actually get tighter than the magic range, which is probably incorrect. So in this case, the raise first middle position stat actually helps us to get a much more accurate read on this guy about what we can re-steal, and it shows us the surprising solution that we can actually re-steal against this guy much, much wider than we would normally re-steal. Alright, so the next stat we're going to take a look at is the steal percent stat, and we're going to use the button steal. and we're going to add this stat to the pop-up, and then we can get steals from the hijack, button, cutoff, and small blind, all that kind of stuff. So button steal is useful because basically in low blinds it tells us how wide we can 3-bet out of the blinds, and in high blinds it tells us how wide we can call wide shovers, which is a really tough thing to have to do. You know, we've got some interesting pivot points which basically help us to call wide shovers based on blind size, but you know, we know that those guys, the bad players, are typically shoving between 25 and 35%. And what if we find from these stats that they're actually shoving much wider from the button? Then we can really come up with some more accurate ranges to call these guys with. So let's take a look at an example of that. Alright, so this is a pretty interesting hand that takes place with us in the small blind. Now normally what we would do is we would use the steal button stat to find hands where we could go ahead and actually blow somebody off a button steal. And in this case, actually, this is sort of the opposite, because we've actually got a very strong hand here. So what you'll see is when we go ahead and and it's folded around to the button's going to raise. Actually, the button steal button stat is only 33%, which is actually fairly narrow. And so actually what we can be thinking here when he raises this is he's actually got a pretty decent hand. And so we don't expect him to be anywhere close to as good as pocket kings. But when we go ahead and decide to re-raise here, we have two options. We can pretty much either go ahead and shove, or we can go ahead and make a smaller 3-bet hoping he can call, because his hand is likely to be pretty strong. So when we raise these kings, we decide to go for the small 3-bet, hoping that this guy's going to call long. And indeed he does. And so when the flop comes down queen high, we're feeling very confident about our hand because we're likely ahead on this board. But now we notice that actually the queen high board may help some of this guy's hands, but a lot of the hands he has, we don't know whether they can stand to call a c-bet. So I've actually pulled this situation up in Flopzilla. You can see we've got him raising about 32%, and I've actually taken the aces, kings, queens, and ace-king out of his range. And the reason why is because I think that he would probably just shove over our 3-bet with those types of hands. So you can see that there's a lot of strong hands in his range, and pocket pairs, and some suited connectors probably. So you can see that top pair would hit this flop about 17% of the time. You can see there's a lot of queens in his range. You can see there's also some pocket pairs below top pair, some middle pairs, that kind of thing. So when we go ahead and we bet on this board, it sort of allows our villain to play perfect poker against us, which we don't really like. If we go ahead and we bet, we would probably bet like half pot and hope to get our whole stack in over 2 cards, the flop and the turn. But if we check here, with a guy who's, it looks a little bit aggressive, I think that we can get him to bluff with more of his range than what he'll call if we bet. So go ahead and check to him, and he goes ahead and shoves. Now, I don't know what he could do this with. He could probably do this with a lot of hands. He could probably do this with ace highs, top pair, pocket pairs below top pair, that kind of thing. A lot of hands, times when I check here, he just thinks that I basically missed, and because the pot's so big, I'm going to give up. So there could be a lot of bluffs in his range. And then, of course, we oblige him by calling because we know our hand's good here majority of the time. He flips over pocket fours. So he probably bluffed off his stack thinking that when we showed weakness, he's got a made hand, and we don't, and he's willing to put the rest of his chips in. And our hand holds up. Alright, so the last stats we're going to be talking about today are the flop c-bet and folds to flop c-bet. And you can find that under continuation bet in the folds to flop c-bet or flop c-bets stats, and then add those. And this stat's useful because it basically tells us how often a good player is c-betting into us. And actually the stat is going to help us a lot to keep us from being exploited on the flop by folding too frequently. In low blinds, it basically tells us how wide we can raise the flop to steal the pot. And in high blinds, it tells us how wide we can 3-bet shove to steal the pot. So let's take a example, a look at an example where we made an interesting play based on using this stat. All right, so in this hand we've got tens in the small blind, and what's going to happen is this guy, 32-14 guy, goes ahead and limps, and he limps from early position, and then a 33-22 guy raises him, but just min raises him. So this could be a pretty big hand, but this guy limping in early position, typically what we think he's going to do this with is hands that he can't raise, probably a lot of pocket pairs and hands that he wants to play for speculative value. So we're going to go ahead and call here too, because now we've got a chance to stack both of these guys. We're getting sort of 13-1, 14-1 implied odds, but actually because we're only calling half a blind or 3/4 of a blind, we're actually even doing better than that. And we're going to go ahead and call and try to set mine with these tens. And then we get a call from the 32-14 guy. So the flop comes down 3-3-5, and the 32-14 guy is going to go ahead and we're going to check, and then he's going to go ahead and lead out for 200 into this pot. Now, when we go down and take a look at these stats, what do we notice about the flop c-bet? It's only 54%. Now, typically somebody's going to hit the flop about 60 to 66% of the time, about 2/3 of the time. So a flop c-bet of about 54% is actually pretty low. And flop c-bets like this guy Copy Fight has of 86 or higher are actually pretty high. And you can see that because if this guy's c-betting 86% of the time, he's c-betting a lot of flops where he's missed. And that's fine. I mean, that's typically what a good tag will do. You can see that even I'm c-betting about 78% of flops. So I'm c-betting some flops that I missed. But this guy is not c-betting any flops he missed. So he's actually not c-betting some flops he hits. And so when he goes ahead and leads out here, my initial reaction is that he definitely has a piece of this board, or has a pocket pair that's actually sort of above this board, and now feels that it's strong enough to go ahead and try to take the pot down. So I don't think he's doing this with air, and I don't think he's doing this with two overs. I think that we got a read of him now based on how tight he is for c-betting the flop, that he either caught a 3, has a set of 5s, or probably has a pocket pair 9s or lower. And the reason I'd say he doesn't have 10s is because we've got 2 10s, so the chance of him having 10s are very small, because there's only one combo of that left. And the chances of him not open raising jacks or better is actually pretty small too, because you can see he raises 14% of the time. So he would be open raising jacks through aces. And so I think that he's probably got a pocket pair here down between 9s and 2s. And the fact that he goes ahead and c-bets out on this board with such a low c-bet percentage means I think he's probably either got a set of 5s, quad 3s, or a pocket pair 9s or less. And when you look at the combos of pocket pairs, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s, 4s, there's basically a lot of combos of those. There's going to be 6 combos of each pocket pair, whereas there's only going to be one combo of 3s and 3 combos of set of 5s. So what's going to happen is I think that there's a lot more combos that we're ahead of than we're behind here. And so when he goes ahead and c-bets out here, I'm just going to go ahead and shove. And I expect him to call because he's got a made hand. He's likely going to call this, and we're ahead of most of his range. So he does go ahead and call, and he shows up with a pair of 7s. And he hits a set, and he actually takes down the pot. But the important thing is that we were ahead when we got all the money in. Alright, so this is a hand where we're going to be taking a look at the fold to flop c-bet stat. We've got king, queen of clubs here in the small blind, and what you can see is we've got a very tight player in the big blind, and so when it's folded around to us, we decide to go ahead and raise to 3 times the big blind to try to steal this pot, which is going to probably be immediately profitable against somebody who's so tight. But also we've got a hand that has good value even if this tight passive player elects to call us. So when he does call, and the flop comes down, a very scary flop for us, because a lot of the hands he's going to be calling us with have aces in their range, and also because he's such a tight player, one thing we might decide to do is elect to check this, but we've already got a fairly big pot here, and so what I'm going to do instead is I see that he's got a fold to flop c-bet of 67%, which is very high. Normally you'll hit the flop about 67%, which means he's folding about half the times he hits the flop. And the reason why this is kind of an interesting hand is not because you might or might not have decided to c-bet on this flop due to the fold to flop c-bet stat. What this tells us is that if we go ahead and bet on a flop like this, and he calls, then we can expect that we're typically looking at a very strong made hand, either a pocket pair below aces that may not be able to fold, or an ace. And so we know from Poker Math That Matters by Owen Gaines, or some other sources where you might have found information on how often a bluff needs to work, that if we go ahead and bet 2/3 flop, we only need alien to fold about 40% of the time for it to be profitable. And we can see here that based on his stats, we think he's going to fold a heck of a lot more than that. So when we go ahead and make our 2/3 pot c-bet, this is probably an immediately profitable bet based on his fold to flop c-bet stat. And we're going to have a really good read on what he's got, what type of hand he's got if he calls. So it's not going to leave us in a tough situation if we go ahead and bet this, and he elects to fold. Alright, so we've taken a look at a couple examples of seeing how a more complex HUD can be useful to gain an edge on regulars in your games. I would go ahead and I would add these stats slowly, and I would get used to them. You want to be comfortable with them, and you don't want to have too many stats on your HUD that make it impossible to use them. If you're wanting to look for stats to put on your HUD, what I suggest you do is you just look for some common situations that you would like to understand better, and in your review see what stats are actually helpful to you to try and pick up a more broad picture of what's going on. And if you find a stat that you're using over and over again, I go ahead and just suggest you add it to your HUD, since you'll have some context for what that stat means. You'll be able to know how to use it effectively. And then you can't emphasize enough the fact that if you don't have an idea what a stat actually means, like what the range means, having it up on your HUD isn't going to be useful. So don't just randomly add a bunch of stats to your HUD just because somebody tells you that you should add stats to your HUD, or gives you a custom HUD that they've made. I really think that you should start with that basic HUD of VPIP, preflop raise, number of hands, and number of blinds, and I think you should add to it slowly as you feel you need stats for making better reads on regulars. So, in conclusion, I think that having advanced HUD can really give you the edge that you need to get beyond ABC, SNG and start crushing some of the regulars. But I suggest you take it slow, and I suggest you sort of use this methodology and maybe start with the stats that I've showed you today and add them first, one at a time, and then when you get beyond that, then you can start to add some other ones. So anyways, good luck at the tables. This is Zero Sum 79 signing off.